My name is Valentina Reyes. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I have been known as the quiet one, the observant daughter, the reasonable woman in the room. I live in Portland now, where the rain falls softly enough to blur the edges of memory, and I work as a financial compliance analyst, a job that sounds dry, maybe even forgettable. People assume that fits me. Careful, methodical, predictable. What they don't see is that I have always been paying attention. 5 years ago, my father died in what everyone agreed was a tragic accident. A brake failure on a winding road outside our hometown. It was ruled mechanical. Unfortunate. No foul play suspected. My mother wept. I held her. The community brought casseroles, and life, at least on the surface, continued. But grief is not a straight line. It's a spiral. It returns you to places you thought you'd already survived. Last winter, while sorting through old boxes in my childhood home, I found something that shifted everything I believed about that day. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet. Paper doesn't scream. Ink doesn't tremble. But the truth can sit in your hands and feel heavier than steel. I found evidence that my mother was the one who tampered with my father's brakes 5 years ago. And then, deeper in a drawer I almost closed without checking, I found her old diary. Inside it was something colder than anger, not rage, not impulse, a calculated, patient plan, a cold-blooded blueprint of revenge, and the terrifying truth behind the accident that killed him. I want to be very clear about something. This is not a story about screaming matches or dramatic showdowns. It is not about vengeance in the way movies portray it. I am not here to humiliate anyone, and I am not here to destroy a person's name. What happened is already irreversible. Nothing I say can change that. This is a story about perception, about how easy it is to underestimate the quiet daughter, about how silence can look like weakness when it is actually restraint, and about the moment restraint becomes a decision. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you exactly who I was in my family, the role I was given, the small things I ignored, the shift that happened inside me when the truth surfaced, and the choice I made once I understood what I was holding. I won't dramatize it. I won't exaggerate. I will tell it the way it unfolded, slowly, quietly, and with more control than anyone expected from me. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar. It simply stands up. Have you ever realized that the person everyone thought was the least powerful in the room was the only one who truly saw what was happening? In my family, I was the reliable one, not the brilliant one. That was my father. Not the passionate one. That was my mother. I was the steady background music, useful, present, rarely noticed unless I stopped. My father, Mateo Reyes, filled rooms before he even entered them. He laughed loudly, spoke confidently, and had the kind of charm that made strangers lean in. People described him as magnetic. He owned a small auto repair business outside Eugene, and customers trusted him instinctively. Even when money was tight, they believed in him. My mother, Camilla, was different. Softer in public, controlled, measured. At home, though, her moods shifted like sudden weather. She could be warm and attentive one day, distant and sharp the next. I learned early that peace required anticipation. I became good at reading micro-expressions before I even knew what that term meant. And then there was I, the easy child, the one teachers praised for maturity, the one relative described as low maintenance. I didn't demand attention. I didn't compete. I observed. At family gatherings, conversations flowed around me. My father told stories. My mother curated the image. I refilled glasses, cleared plates, and remembered who preferred tea over coffee. It wasn't servitude. It was invisibility dressed as helpfulness. If someone forgot my birthday, I reminded them gently. If my achievements were overshadowed by my father's latest business expansion, I congratulated him first. I told myself it didn't matter, that being steady was a strength. When I chose to study finance instead of something exciting, my father laughed and called me practical. My mother said, "At least one of us understands responsibility." It sounded like praise. It wasn't. Responsibility was the role assigned to me early. The emotional regulator, the quiet absorber of tension. If my parents argued, I distracted myself with homework and headphones. If my mother grew cold, I adapted. If my father dismissed something, I told myself he was tired. After he died, that role intensified. People assumed I would fall apart. I didn't. I organized paperwork. I coordinated insurance meetings. I comforted my mother. I handled bank statements while still grieving in private. Relatives praised my strength. "You're just like your father," they said. They meant capable. They didn't mean perceptive. What no one realized was that being overlooked gave me something rare: uninterrupted sight. When people believe you are harmless, they stop performing around you. They drop masks. They speak freely. And I remembered everything. At the time, though, I still believed in the story we were given. Brake failure, tragic accident, wrong place, wrong time. I accepted it the way you accept sudden rain, unpleasant but natural, because that was who I was to them. The daughter who accepts, the woman who adapts, the steady one who never questions too loudly. It would take 5 years and a thin layer of dust on an old drawer before I realized how dangerous that assumption had been. The first crack didn't feel like a revelation. It felt like a misplaced detail. About 3 months after my father's funeral, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my mother, sorting through a stack of unopened mail. Insurance correspondence, bank statements, sympathy cards that had arrived late and were never answered. The house was quieter than it had ever been. Not peaceful, just hollow. My father's absence had a sound, a low hum where his voice used to be. I remember holding an envelope from the auto shop's parts supplier. It was dated 2 weeks before the accident. I handed it to my mother casually. "Do you want me to open this?" She hesitated. It was brief, so brief that most people wouldn't have noticed. But hesitation is my native language. "No," she said. "That's old, it doesn't matter." It was such a small thing, so easy to dismiss. Grief makes people protective, defensive. I told myself that's all it was. But later that evening, when she thought I had gone upstairs, I heard the soft rip of paper from the kitchen. Not dramatic, not frantic, just deliberate. The next morning, the envelope was gone. If you had asked me then what I thought, I would have said nothing. I didn't confront her. I didn't search the trash. I didn't create a scene. I filed it away. Weeks passed. My mother began reorganizing the garage, something my father had never allowed anyone else to touch. He was territorial about his tools. Every wrench had a place. Every part is labelled. One afternoon, I found her standing by his old metal cabinet, holding a small plastic case. She closed it quickly when she saw me. "What's that?" I asked. "Just junk," she replied. Old things, I'm throwing most of it out." Again, the tone, not defensive, controlled, efficient. I stepped closer. "Do you want help?" "No, I've got it." That night, the cabinet was empty. I told myself she was grieving in her own way, clearing space, removing reminders. People handle loss differently. That's what I believed. But here's the thing about small cuts. They don't bleed immediately. They sting later. A month after that, I met one of my father's longtime customers at a grocery store. He hugged me awkwardly, the way grown men do when they don't know how to comfort someone. "Your dad mentioned something strange the last time I saw him," he said, almost as an afterthought. "Said he thought someone had been messing with one of the cars in the shop. Couldn't figure out who." My stomach tightened. "Messing with how?" I asked lightly. He shrugged. "Brake line on a client's truck was loosened. He thought it was a mistake at first, but your dad wasn't careless." He said it as praise. I smiled politely, changed the subject, bought my groceries, drove home. And then I sat in my car for 10 full minutes before going inside. Because my father didn't drive a client's truck the day he died. He drove his own car. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't spiral into theories. I didn't let myself imagine something darker than coincidence. That would have required a kind of courage I didn't yet have. Instead, I did what I had always done. I absorbed it. I added it to the mental ledger I kept without even realizing I kept one. Envelope hesitation, garage cabinet, customer comment, small isolated fragments. Individually, they meant nothing. Together they felt like a sentence forming, but I wasn't ready to read it. So I told myself the most comforting story available. Grief distorts memory. Trauma makes patterns where none exist. My mother was hurting. I was projecting. Still, that night, for the first time since the accident, I dreamed of brakes failing. And when I woke up, my first emotion wasn't sadness. There was doubt. A quiet, dangerous kind of doubt. Doubt is uncomfortable, so most of us try to soften it. After that conversation at the grocery store, I did what I had been trained to do my entire life. I minimized my own instincts. I told myself I was being dramatic, that trauma can attach meaning to neutral events, that grief wants a villain because randomness feels unbearable. And my mother leaned into that narrative without even knowing she was doing it. Whenever my father's accident came up in conversation, she controlled the tone. She described it the same way every time. It was instant. He didn't suffer. It was a mechanical failure. Her voice never cracked on those words. It only trembled when she spoke about missing him. Precision without vulnerability. I noticed it, and then I scolded myself for noticing. If I asked small logistical questions about the repair history of the car, about the police report, she would sigh. Not angrily, but wearily. "Valentina," she'd say, "why are you digging? It won't bring him back." It sounded reasonable. It also ended the conversation every time. Slowly, my curiosity became framed as insensitivity. If I lingered too long over paperwork, I was obsessing. If I mentioned the customer's comment, I was overthinking. If I asked about the items she cleared from the garage, I was holding on to the past. None of it was overtly cruel. That's what made it effective. Disrespect doesn't always shout. Sometimes it subtly rewrites your role. Mine shifted from a responsible daughter to an overly analytical one. The implication was gentle, but firm. I was creating discomfort where none needed to exist. So I adjusted. I stopped asking questions aloud. I researched privately instead. I requested a copy of the accident report under the guise of organizing records. I reread it at night, cross-referencing timestamps, mechanical notes, and witness statements. Brake failure due to line rupture. No sign of external tampering noted at the scene. It was clean, too clean. But I told myself that was paranoia speaking. At family dinners, relatives would praise my mother's resilience. "Camilla has been so strong," they'd say. "I don't know how she does it." I would nod. No one asked how I was doing anymore. Not really. My stability made me invisible again, the quiet daughter who handles things. And I played the part. There's a strange safety in being underestimated. When people assume you won't push back, they become careless in smaller ways. My mother began making comments about finances, about how difficult things were, about how my father had hidden certain debts from her. I had access to all the accounts. I knew exactly what existed and what didn't. Her version of events didn't match the numbers. When I gently corrected her once, just once, she smiled thinly and said, "You don't understand everything that goes on in a marriage." It wasn't an explanation, it was a dismissal. I felt it then. Not anger, not betrayal, something quieter. Erosion. The small repeated message was that my perception was incomplete, that my instincts were excessive. My role was to manage logistics, not question narratives. And for a while I accepted that, because confronting the alternative, that my mother might be manipulating reality, felt too destabilizing. If she wasn't trustworthy, what foundation did I have left? So I normalized the discomfort. I told myself families are complicated, that grief makes people defensive, that I was searching for meaning where there was none. But normalization has a cost. Every time I swallowed a question, it didn't disappear. It settled. It layered. It waited. And the most dangerous thing about being dismissed repeatedly is this. One day you stop trying to be heard. You start listening instead, closely. There's a moment in every family when you realize you were never just participating. You were cast. It happened quietly for me. Not in an argument, not in a revelation. Just a Tuesday afternoon, standing in my mother's living room while she explained to a family friend how lucky she was to have a daughter who handled everything. "Valentina's so good with paperwork," she said, smiling at me as if I were a well-trained assistant. "I don't have to worry about a thing. She takes care of all the complicated parts." I smiled back. Reliable, capable, useful, invisible. I began to see the pattern clearly then. My role wasn't accidental, it was functional. I was the stabilizer, the quiet executor, the one who absorbed tension so others didn't have to. My father had cast me first. "You're the practical one," he'd say when I was young. "You don't get emotional like your mother." It sounded like admiration, but it was an assignment. I learned that my value was tied to control. My mother reinforced it after he died. I became the translator between her grief and the world. I handled insurance disputes. I scheduled meetings with attorneys. I organized tax records. And when I asked questions about inconsistencies, the dynamic shifted instantly. "You're being cold," she told me once. "This isn't a spreadsheet, Valentina. It's your father." It was subtle, effective. My logic was reframed as heartlessness. So I adjusted again. I kept my tone softer. I asked fewer direct questions. I began documenting privately instead of debating openly. Dates, statements, changes in her story, financial transfers, small inconsistencies that most people would dismiss as stress. The more I complied externally, the more space I gained internally. That's the irony of underestimation. Because I didn't challenge her publicly, she stopped guarding her words around me. She assumed my silence meant agreement. She assumed my calm meant compliance. And that's when I realized there's something important. The role they gave me was never powerless. It was observational. When people think you are safe, harmless, they reveal things. They contradict themselves casually. They speak without rehearsing. One evening, about a year after the accident, my mother was on the phone in the kitchen. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was in the hallway grabbing a glass of water. Do the skidges. Her voice was low, controlled. "No one suspects anything," she said. A pause, then softer. It was mechanical. That's what they ruled. My chest tightened. I stepped back before she could see me. I didn't confront her. I didn't demand context. I waited. When she hung up and saw me later, she was perfectly composed. Asked me about work, commented on the weather, offered tea. The performance was seamless. And that was the moment I understood my true position. I wasn't the fragile daughter being protected from harsh truths. I was the overlooked witness. But still, I wasn't ready to name it, because naming it would mean accepting that the person who taught me how to braid my hair, who held me during thunderstorms, might also be capable of something far darker. So I stayed in character, reliable, useful, quiet. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't playing the role anymore. I was studying it. The shift didn't happen the day I heard her say, "No one suspects anything." It didn't happen when the garage was emptied. It didn't even happen when the customer mentioned the brake line. It happened on an ordinary Sunday, almost 2 years after my father's death. I was alone in the house. My mother had gone to visit a friend, and I was packing old photo albums into storage boxes, the kind with plastic sleeves that stick slightly when you turn the pages. Birthdays, vacations, a life that looked intact from every angle the camera captured. I wasn't searching for anything. That's important. I wasn't playing detective. I wasn't digging for proof. I was simply trying to reduce clutter. In the back of my parents' bedroom closet, behind a stack of folded blankets, there was a narrow wooden box I didn't recognize. It wasn't ornate, just plain. The kind of thing you overlook unless you move something else first. I almost didn't open it. Inside were small objects that didn't belong together. An old watch of my father's, a few loose receipts, and a thin notebook with a dark blue cover. It wasn't labeled. I sat on the edge of the bed before opening it. Not out of fear, out of habit. I had learned to pause before stepping into emotional territory. The handwriting was my mother's. The first few pages were mundane: grocery lists, reminders, appointments. Then, gradually, the tone shifted. Less logistical, more reflective. And then I reached an entry dated 3 weeks before my father died. "He thinks I don't see it," she had written. "The lies, the humiliation, the way he underestimates me." My breathing slowed. The next entry was colder. "Some lessons can't be taught with words." I felt something unfamiliar then. Not shock, not grief. Clarity. The entries weren't hysterical. They weren't the ramblings of someone out of control. They were composed, analytical. She described feeling invisible in her marriage, described financial disagreements, described resentment that had hardened over the years. And then one sentence: "He trusts his car more than he trusts me." The date was 10 days before the accident. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I didn't flip through the rest frantically. I closed the notebook gently and placed it back in the box exactly as I found it. That was the shift. Because in that moment, I stopped needing reassurance that I was imagining things. For 2 years, I had been negotiating with doubt, offering explanations, granting it alternatives, protecting myself from the possibility that my mother was capable of something irreversible. But ink doesn't negotiate. It records. I didn't confront her when she returned home. I made dinner, asked about her friend, listened to her recount harmless details about coffee and conversation. And while she spoke, I studied her differently. Not as my mother. As a person. A woman who felt wronged, a woman who believed she had been underestimated, a woman who valued control. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the full sentence forming from all the fragments I had collected. Not an accident, intention. And here is the quiet truth no one prepares you for. The most destabilizing part of discovering betrayal isn't rage. It's the realization that your instincts were correct all along. That night, lying awake in my childhood bedroom, I didn't feel anger. I felt alignment, the small cuts, the dismissed questions, the rehearsed narrative, the phone call, the diary. They were no longer isolated. They were a structure. And I understood something else too. If my mother had planned something once, patiently, methodically, then she respected strategy, which meant that if the truth was going to surface, it would not be through emotional confrontation. It would be through precision. That was the day I stopped being the daughter trying to understand her grief and became the woman quietly assessing her options. After I read the diary, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was afraid of my mother, because I was recalibrating. There's a difference. For years, my silence had been reactive. I stayed quiet to avoid conflict, to maintain peace, to preserve the image of a functional family. My restraint had been defensive. Now it has become deliberate. I didn't confront her about the notebook. I didn't search the house again. I didn't accuse, hint, or test her with leading questions. Instead, I watched. Silence, when chosen, changes posture. It becomes stillness instead of hesitation, and stillness unsettles people who expect compliance. At first, she didn't notice the shift. Why would she? I was still helping with paperwork, still visiting regularly, still asking about her health, errands, and garden plans. But I was no longer absorbing her narrative. When she described my father as reckless with money, I didn't nod automatically. I simply said, "That's not what the statements show." Calmly, no edge. She would blink, recalculating, then move on. When she referred to the accident as fate, I stopped echoing the word. I would say instead, it was preventable, not accusatory, just factual. The first time I used that word, she went very still. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean, brake failures don't happen without cause." I held her gaze. She smiled, too quickly. "Machines break, Valentina." "Sometimes," I replied, and then I changed the subject. That was the pattern I adopted. Small corrections, no escalation, no drama. Silence can be mistaken for weakness, but controlled silence, paired with subtle precision, creates tension. I could feel it building. She began asking more questions about my work, about what exactly I did in compliance, about whether I ever dealt with investigations. I answered honestly. "Sometimes," I said. "Mostly documentation review, pattern analysis." I watched the information land. I wasn't threatening her. I wasn't even implying anything. I was reminding her gently of who I was. At the same time, I began organizing everything I had collected. Copies of financial statements from the year of the accident, the police report, the mechanic's assessment, the diary entries, which I photographed discreetly one afternoon when she was out. I didn't remove the notebook from the house. Taking it would have been impulsive, and impulsive is detectable. Instead, I built redundancy. Digital backups are stored securely. Notes in my black leather notebook, dates, phrases, tonal shifts. The more structured my documentation became, the calmer I felt, because clarity reduces fear. One evening, about 3 months after finding the diary, my mother asked me an unusual question over dinner. "Do you ever think about letting things rest?" she said carefully. I looked up from my plate. Resting and ignoring aren't the same thing. Her fork paused midair. "You think I'm ignoring something?" she asked. "I think everyone ignores something," I replied. "Until they can't." There was no accusation in my voice. That was the power of it. She studied me longer than usual that night, as if measuring distance, as if trying to determine whether the quiet daughter was still predictable. What she didn't understand was this. I wasn't waiting for an emotional confession. I was waiting for confirmation, for something external, tangible, verifiable. Because if this was going to move beyond suspicion, it needed to withstand scrutiny beyond my own intuition. Silence was no longer about survival. It was about positioning, and she still believed I was simply being practical. That assumption would become her greatest mistake. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. I continued visiting my mother twice a week. I continued bringing groceries when she forgot. I continued managing small financial tasks she claimed were too overwhelming. To anyone observing us, nothing had changed. But underneath that surface, I was building structure. The first thing I did was request a more detailed copy of the accident file. Not just the summary report, the full mechanical assessment. In my profession, I know how to ask for documents without raising alarms. Language matters. Specificity matters. When the expanded report arrived, I didn't read it emotionally. I read it the way I would read a compliance case. Brake line rupture consistent with corrosion. No visible tool marks were documented at the scene. Vehicle towed before secondary inspection due to weather conditions. That last line stayed with me. Before secondary inspection, I tracked down the towing company listed in the file. Their records were archived but not destroyed. I requested confirmation of the vehicle's storage duration before it was transferred to the insurance salvage yard. 3 days. 3 days during which the car sat unsecured in a public lot. Most people would interpret that as meaningless. I saw vulnerability. Next, I contacted the salvage yard under the pretense of retrieving a personal item that may have been left in the trunk. It was plausible. Grieving families forget things. The car had been dismantled years ago. Nothing remained. But the manager, an older man with a patient voice, mentioned something casually while searching his database. "Shame about that one," he said. "Looked like someone had worked on it recently. Brake assembly bolts were newer than the rest of the undercarriage." My pulse didn't spike. I asked evenly, "Newer how?" "Cleaner, lesser rust, not factory old." I thanked him. Hung up. Wrote the date and exact wording in my notebook. Individually, none of this proved anything. Together, it formed direction. I began revisiting my mother's diary entries more carefully. I transcribed them verbatim into a secure file, noting dates relative to mechanical service records I pulled from my father's shop archives. 10 days before the accident, resentment entry. 7 days before, note about teaching a lesson. 3 days before, no entry. 2 days before, as soon. I cross-referenced that with the shop's security footage retention policy from 5 years ago. 30 days. Which meant the footage was long gone. But service logs remained. On the day before his death, my father had closed the shop early. No client appointments scheduled. No staff present after 3 p.m. He had stayed alone. That detail tightened something inside me. Not panic, but understanding. If someone wanted access to his car without witnesses, that window existed. And who had unrestricted access to the property? Family. Throughout all of this, my mother remained composed. She mentioned occasionally how grateful she was that the investigation was straightforward. She said it with relief, sometimes with something else beneath it, anticipation. What she never noticed was that I stopped reacting emotionally to her version of events. No more affirming nods, no more soft reassurances. Just listening. One afternoon, she asked if I still kept journals as I did as a teenager. "Sometimes," I said. She smiled faintly. "Writing things down can make them feel bigger than they are." I met her eyes. Or clearer. She looked away first. Preparation is quiet because it has to be. There were no late-night confrontations, no secret meetings with detectives, no dramatic discoveries hidden in obvious places. Just data, patterns, and the steady realization that my mother's diary wasn't just emotional venting. It was sequencing. The most unsettling part wasn't that she might have tampered with the brakes. It was that she might have believed she was justified. And justification, when documented in someone's own handwriting, becomes something far heavier than suspicion. By the end of that year, I no longer questioned whether something had been done intentionally. The only question left was what I was going to do with the truth, once I could prove it beyond doubt. And I was closer than she realized. The confirmation didn't arrive like thunder. It arrived as paperwork. Nearly 3 years after I first found the diary, I requested one more document, this time from my father's business insurance provider. It was something I should have examined earlier, but grief delays certain curiosities. I asked for the original maintenance claim history tied to his personal vehicle in the 6 months leading up to the accident. There had been no prior brake issues, no service complaints, no corrosion flags, no pending part replacements. The car had passed inspection 8 weeks before his death. Corrosion severe enough to rupture a brake line doesn't accelerate that quickly without environmental damage or external interference. I knew that. More importantly, so would anyone reviewing it objectively. Still, this was circumstantial. Technical inconsistencies. Suggestive, but not definitive. The definitive piece came from somewhere I almost overlooked. My father's shop accountant, Mr. Hanley, retired the year after the accident. I reached out under the pretense of reconciling some archived tax records. He agreed to meet for coffee. We spoke about numbers at first, routine things. Then, gently, I asked whether my father had ever mentioned concerns about internal access to the shop. Mr. Hanley frowned slightly. "There was that one argument," he said slowly, "about the spare key." My body went very still. "What argument?" "Your mother had one made without telling him. Said it was for emergencies. He wasn't pleased. I didn't interrupt. He told me he'd changed the cabinet lock where he kept certain parts, Mr. Hanley continued. Said he didn't like surprises. The cabinet, the one she emptied after his death. I thanked him calmly, paid for the coffee, walked back to my car without rushing. Inside the quiet of the driver's seat, everything aligned with an almost mathematical precision. Access, timing, resentment documented, mechanical inconsistency, newer bolts were observed post-accident, a spare key argument. It wasn't one dramatic confession. It was architecture. And architecture is harder to dismiss than emotion. That evening, I returned to my mother's house as usual. We had dinner. She spoke about a neighbour's renovation project, about rising grocery prices, about ordinary life. I watched her hands as she poured tea, steady, controlled. Did she believe the past was sealed? Or did she live in constant calculation? There's a strange loneliness in holding the truth alone. Not because you need validation, but because once you see clearly, you cannot unsee. I didn't feel rage. I felt distance. Not physical distance, structural. The woman across from me was no longer just my mother. She was someone who had potentially engineered an outcome and trusted that no one, especially not me, would ever connect the fragments. And here is the quiet revelation that settled into me that night. She underestimated not my intelligence, but my threshold. She believed I would choose comfort over clarity, that I would preserve family image over factual truth. She was wrong. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I finalized digital copies of every document. I consulted, anonymously, with a legal advisor about statutes of limitation related to vehicular tampering and wrongful death. There were still pathways, complicated, difficult but real. The leverage was no longer emotional. It was procedural, and that changed everything. Because once truth becomes actionable, silence stops being protection. It becomes a strategy. I went to bed that night knowing one thing with absolute certainty. The story of my father's accident was not finished, and I was the only one holding the complete version. There is a moment when evidence stops being information and becomes a responsibility. For nearly 3 years, I had collected quietly, verified calmly, cross-referenced patiently. Every inconsistency, every document, every archived statement had been filtered through one question. Is this objective or is this grief? By the time I sat alone at my kitchen table on a grey Thursday evening, I could no longer pretend it was grief. The pattern was too consistent. The access is too plausible. The timing is too precise. And the diary, cold in its composure, sat scanned and preserved in 3 secure locations. I opened my notebook and drew a single line down the center of the page. On the left, I wrote, silence. On the right, action. Under silence, I listed what would happen if I chose to do nothing. My mother would age peacefully. The official narrative would remain intact. Our extended family would never fracture under suspicion. I would carry the knowledge privately. There was safety in that option. Stability. Familiar roles. Under action, the list was less predictable. Formal investigation reopened. Forensic re-examination of archived documentation. Legal proceedings. Public exposure. Permanent rupture of family structure. And something else. Irreversibility. Once initiated, there would be no quiet return to dinners and polite conversations. No pretending. No ambiguity. I sat with both columns for a long time. This wasn't about revenge. If it had been, the decision would have been emotional and immediate. This was about alignment with my own moral code. Truth over comfort. Accountability without spectacle. Justice without cruelty. If my father's death had been intentional, then silence wasn't neutrality. It was complicity. And here is the part that surprised me. I didn't feel hatred toward my mother. I felt clarity about consequence. She had made a decision years ago, if the evidence meant what it clearly suggested. A calculated decision, executed under the assumption that no one would assemble the fragments. If I now chose silence, I would be making a calculated decision too, just in the opposite direction. I closed my notebook and looked around my apartment. The quiet felt heavier than usual, not oppressive, just definitive. I picked up my phone and drafted an email to the legal advisor I had consulted anonymously months earlier. This time I used my full name. I requested a formal appointment. My tone was factual. Concise. No emotional language. Just documentation attached and a request for procedural guidance regarding reopening a wrongful death case under new evidentiary findings. Before pressing send, I paused, not because I doubted the evidence, because I understood what would follow. There would be questions, investigators, re-interviews, scrutiny. My mother would know, almost immediately, that something had shifted, and she would know who had shifted it. I inhaled slowly. Then I pressed send. The sound was small, a soft digital whoosh, but it marked the end of something that had defined my entire life, the role of quiet absorber. From that moment forward, my silence was no longer protection. It was motion, and the path ahead would not allow retreat. Action, when done correctly, does not announce itself. It restructures reality before anyone realizes it has moved. After sending that email, I did not feel adrenaline. I did not pace or spiral. I went to work the next morning, attended my meetings, reviewed compliance reports, and answered emails about routine audits. The world did not shift dramatically, but behind the scenes it began adjusting. My attorney, measured, methodical, outlined the first step. Submit a formal petition to reopen the case based on newly surfaced written material and procedural inconsistencies in the original mechanical review. No accusations, no emotional language, just documentation. The diary excerpts were presented not as proof of intent, but as evidence warranting further examination. The maintenance records, towing timeline, and salvage yard observation were included as supporting inconsistencies. Everything was structured, clinical. I signed the documents without trembling. Within weeks, an investigator contacted me. Professional, neutral. He asked careful questions about how I obtained the diary, whether anyone else had access to the shop, whether my relationship with my mother was strained. I answered honestly. I am not here because of conflict, I told him. I am here because of alignment with documented facts. He paused before responding. That's not something we hear often from family members, he said. I didn't interpret that as praise, just acknowledgement. Meanwhile, I continued visiting my mother. If anything, I became more composed. She sensed something. Subtle changes in posture cannot be hidden entirely, but she had no evidence of what was shifting. Not yet. One evening, she mentioned casually that she'd been contacted about a request for archived records related to my father's accident. Her eyes stayed on mine longer than usual. Do you know anything about that? She asked. Yes, I replied evenly. I submitted new documentation. Silence stretched between us. For what purpose? She asked carefully. To ensure the original conclusion was accurate. The phrasing mattered. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It was ruled an accident. Rulings can be reviewed, I said. There was no accusation in my tone, no raised voice, just a fact. She leaned back slightly, studying me. You're digging up pain that doesn't need to be reopened, she said. Truth doesn't expire, I replied, and then I picked up my tea. That was the entire confrontation. No shouting, no emotional implosion, no such humor. Just awareness settling into the room. After that evening, her behavior shifted. She became more attentive, more cautious with language. She asked more about my legal knowledge, my schedule, and my intentions. I answered selectively, but never dishonestly. At the same time, a forensic review of the mechanical report was initiated. An independent expert was assigned to re-evaluate archived photographs from the accident scene, images that had been deemed non-essential at the time. The process was slow, deliberately so. Justice built through procedure does not move quickly. Weeks turned into months. I did not push publicly. I did not discuss the case with the extended family. I did not frame myself as a victim or crusader. I allowed the machinery of review to turn quietly. My mother, however, began losing certainty. I could see it in the way she monitored conversations, in the way she occasionally asked if I was doing okay, as if searching for emotional instability to attribute my actions to. But I was calm, because this was no longer about suspicion. It was about structure catching up to truth. And structures, once set in motion, do not stop because someone becomes uncomfortable. They move until they reach a conclusion. Consequences rarely arrive with sirens. They arrive as letters, certified mail, official seals, neutral language that changes the temperature of a room without raising its volume. The first formal notice went to my mother 3 months after the petition was filed, a request for cooperation in a reopened review of the accident's mechanical findings. It did not accuse her of anything. It simply informed her that new material evidence had surfaced requiring examination. She called me that evening. Her voice was steady, but thinner than usual. Did you know about this? She asked. Yes. A pause. You went further than you implied. I followed the procedure. You're making this public? No, I corrected gently. I'm making it reviewed. Silence again. It was the kind of silence where two people understand that something irreversible has begun. Over the next few weeks, Subtle fractures appeared in her carefully maintained composure. She began revisiting old narratives with unusual insistence, repeating details about the day of the accident as though rehearsing them aloud could reinforce their stability. "He left in a hurry," she said once. "He wasn't thinking clearly." "That's not reflected in the timeline," I replied evenly. She stopped speaking. The extended family started hearing about the reopened review. Not from me, from her. She framed it as confusion, as an unnecessary disturbance, as my difficulty is letting go. Some relatives called to check on me. "Are you sure this is healthy?" one aunt asked softly. "Sometimes we have to accept what hurts." "I am accepting it," I said. "That's why I'm doing this." I did not argue. I did not defend myself beyond that. Meanwhile, the independent forensic specialist completed a comparative analysis of the archived brake assembly photographs. The conclusion wasn't explosive, it was restrained due. Evidence consistent with post-manufacture tool interaction on brake line fittings. Insufficient original inspection depth due to weather-related procedural limitations. Further inquiry recommended. Not proof, but no longer an accident without question. When investigators requested a formal interview with my mother regarding access to the shop and vehicle prior to the incident, her calm began to thin into irritation. "This is absurd," she told me one afternoon. "They're asking about keys, about locks, as if I'm some kind of suspect." I met her gaze. "They're asking because it's relevant." She studied me, searching for emotion. Anger, regret, something she could use to destabilize my position. She found none. That's when the shift truly began, not in documents, but in power. For years, she had controlled the narrative through certainty, through emotional framing, through the assumption that no one would question the original conclusion deeply enough to challenge it. Now she was being asked to explain. Not by me, by structure. And structure does not respond to charm or indignation. It responds to consistency. The most striking change wasn't her fear. It was her realization that I was no longer movable. Not through guilt, not through family loyalty, not through emotional appeals. For the first time in my life, she was encountering me not as a daughter, but as an independent axis. And that unsettled her more than the investigation itself. Because investigations can be managed. A recalibrated daughter cannot. The consequences had begun. Not loudly, but definitely. Panic, when it finally surfaced, did not look dramatic. It looked like urgency disguised as reason. My mother began calling more frequently. Not to argue, she had already sensed that arguments would not move me, but to negotiate tone. "We can handle this privately," she suggested one afternoon, her voice softer than I'd heard it in years. "If there are misunderstandings, we can clarify them without involving outsiders." Outsiders? That option existed 5 years ago, I replied calmly. "Not now." She exhaled sharply. "You're turning this into something it doesn't have to be." "I didn't turn it into anything," I said. "I documented what already existed." The shift from irritation to pressure happened gradually. She began referencing family reputation, community perception, the emotional toll on relatives. "Your father wouldn't want this," she said once. That was the only time my voice changed, just slightly. "You don't get to speak for him." Silence followed, heavy, measured. Investigators requested a second interview after inconsistencies emerged in her initial account of key access and shop visits in the week prior to the accident. She had stated she hadn't been to the shop that week. Security logs from the building's alarm system, archived longer than expected, showed a disarm entry under her code 2 nights before his death. When they informed her of that discrepancy, she called me immediately. "They're twisting timelines," she insisted. "I must have stopped by briefly. That doesn't mean anything." "It means your first statement wasn't accurate," I said. Her breathing quickened. "Do you think I did something?" There it was. The question she had avoided for years, I answered carefully. "I think the facts deserve alignment." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one that matters." The distance between us was no longer subtle. It was structural and visible. The extended family began sensing something deeper than review. Conversations grew strained, invitations fewer. My mother alternated between portraying herself as confused and as betrayed. "You've chosen strangers over your own family," she said one evening. "I chose procedure," I corrected. Behind the scenes, the forensic specialist submitted a supplemental opinion. The brake line fittings showed rotational stress, consistent with manual loosening prior to rupture under pressure. While not conclusive without physical evidence, which no longer existed, the pattern could not be attributed solely to corrosion with confidence. It was enough. Prosecutorial review began. Not a guarantee of charges, but movement. When my mother received notice that the case had shifted from administrative review to potential criminal inquiry, her composure finally fractured. Not in screaming, not in collapse, but in something quieter. She stopped correcting her posture around me, stopped rehearsing narratives. One night, she sat at the kitchen table long after dinner was cleared and said almost to herself, "You could still stop this." I looked at her steadily. "No," I said, "I can't." Because that was the truth. Even if I withdrew, the process was no longer mine to control. That's what she hadn't anticipated. She believed I was the mechanism. She didn't realize I had only been the trigger. Once engaged, systems operate independently of personal emotion. And by the time she understood that, it was too late to reposition the story. Too late to erase the diary. Too late to reframe the bolts. Too late to return to the version of me who absorbed discomfort to preserve peace. The consequences were no longer abstract. They were procedural. And procedure does not respond to regret. The formal confrontation did not happen in a courtroom. It happened at her dining table. By then, the investigation had reached a point where prosecutors were evaluating whether the documented inconsistencies, forensic reassessment, and written material met the threshold for charges. Nothing had been announced publicly. Nothing had been finalized. But the air had changed. She asked me to come over one evening. Her voice on the phone was composed, almost gentle. "I think we need to speak plainly." Plainly, she said. When I arrived, the house felt smaller than I remembered. Not physically, structurally, as if the weight of unsaid things had compressed the walls. We sat across from each other without tea, without pretense. She didn't start with denial. She started with context. "You were young," she said. "You didn't see what that marriage was like." I didn't interrupt. "He embarrassed me," she continued. "Financially, personally. He made decisions without consulting me. He treated me like I was decorative." Her voice didn't rise. It thinned. "I found out things," she added, "about debts, about lies." I held her gaze steadily. "None of that changes what happened." Her eyes sharpened slightly. "You don't know what happened, eh?" "I know enough." A long pause stretched between us. Then she asked the question differently than before. "If someone feels trapped for years," she said carefully, "and finally acts to protect themselves, is that always cruelty?" There it was. Not a confession, a philosophical repositioning, I answered without anger. "Protection doesn't require destruction." Her jaw tightened. "You think you're morally superior?" "No," I said. "I think actions have consequences." We sat in silence after that. Not explosive, not theatrical. Measured. "I never meant for you to carry this," she said finally. "That wasn't your choice to make," I replied. For the first time in the entire process, her composure slipped. Not into hysteria, but into something closer to fatigue. "You've dismantled everything," she said quietly. "I didn't dismantle it," I corrected. "I stopped holding it together." That was the closest we came to emotional confrontation. No shouting, no accusations screamed across the room, no dramatic declarations of guilt. Just two adults sitting across from each other, both aware that a line had been crossed years ago, and another line had been crossed the moment I chose to act. When I stood to leave, she didn't try to stop me. She didn't apologize. She didn't confess. But she no longer denied the architecture. And that was enough. Because this was never about extracting an admission. It was about aligning reality with fact. As I walked to my car that night, I didn't feel triumph. I felt completion. The quiet daughter had not exploded. She had simply refused to remain misaligned. And that refusal had shifted everything. People assume that when something like this ends, you either collapse or you harden. I did neither. The legal process continued beyond that final conversation at her dining table. It moved through its channels, slowly and deliberately, as systems do. I won't detail every procedural outcome here, not because it doesn't matter, but because this story was never about spectacle. It was about alignment. My relationship with my mother changed permanently. Not in dramatic explosions, in distance. Measured, quiet distance. We speak rarely now, and when we do, it is factual, polite, controlled. Some family members still believe I overreached. Others avoid the topic entirely. A few, quietly, have thanked me for asking questions they were afraid to form. I don't correct anyone anymore, because I am no longer trying to be understood. For most of my life, I believed my strength was endurance. Staying calm, absorbing tension, keeping structures intact, even when they are strained under invisible weight. I thought love meant preservation at any cost. I was wrong. Love without truth becomes maintenance. And maintenance, when it protects harm, becomes participation. What changed in me wasn't my intelligence. It wasn't my patience. I had always possessed those. What changed was my threshold. I no longer measure my actions by how comfortable they make others feel. I measure them by whether they align with what is demonstrably real. That shift has reshaped more than my family dynamic. At work, I speak earlier when something feels inconsistent. In friendships, I no longer minimize my perception to avoid friction. In relationships, I choose transparency over performance. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about control over your own alignment. For years, I was underestimated because I did not compete for volume, because I didn't dramatize discomfort, because I looked compliant. Now I understand something I didn't then. Stillness is not passivity. Observation is not a weakness. Documentation is not an obsession. They are powerful when used ethically. I don't wake up angry. I don't replay conversations. I don't fantasize about alternate endings. My father is still gone. That reality doesn't soften, but it is no longer wrapped in ambiguity. And ambiguity is heavier than grief. If there is one identity I've shed completely, it is the role of emotional absorber. I no longer exist to stabilize narratives that conflict with evidence. I exist to stand inside clarity, even when clarity fractures comfort. That doesn't make me fearless. It makes me grounded. Grounded people are difficult to move. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a final revelation, a confession, a perfectly wrapped ending where every question is answered and every consequence feels proportionate. Life doesn't work that way. What I can tell you is this. The truth did not explode my world. It clarified it. For years, I lived inside a version of reality that was comfortable but incomplete. I told myself that loyalty meant silence, that stability meant preservation, that asking hard questions was a form of betrayal. It wasn't. The real betrayal would have been knowing and choosing comfort anyway. When I found evidence that my mother was the one who tampered with my father's brakes 5 years ago, I didn't become someone new. I became someone aligned. When her old diary revealed a cold-blooded plan of revenge and the terrifying truth behind the accident that killed him, I wasn't consumed by rage. I was confronted with responsibility. We like to believe that justice is loud. It demands confrontation and dramatic declarations. But sometimes justice is procedural. It is documentation. It is pressing send on an email you know will change everything. It is choosing clarity over convenience. This story is not about destroying a parent. It is not about revenge. It is about refusing to participate in a narrative that causes harm. There is a cost to that choice. Distance, misunderstanding, the loss of roles you once played well. But there is also something you gain that cannot be taken back. Internal coherence. When your actions match your values, you sleep differently. You stand differently. You no longer negotiate with your own instincts. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Pay attention to the small inconsistencies. Document what feels misaligned, and don't mistake your quiet for weakness. Sometimes the most underestimated person in the room is the only one capable of holding the full picture. I'm curious. If you discovered something like this about someone you love, would you choose comfort or clarity?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye!